Hello and welcome to today's lecture, Reinventing the Viewer. And this lecture today is at Limehouse Marina, where I live on my boat, just outside of central London. So welcome to my home. I'd like to start the lecture today with a question. Can art exist without an audience? Think about the question and think about the individual terms. What is art? What is an audience? How do they relate to each other? And I think this question really gets to the very heart of how we define art. So pause and discuss your brief and initial thoughts about this question. In recent decades, contemporary art... Sorry, I know the ducks are a bit noisy. In recent decades, contemporary art created through a process of participation and interaction has drawn increasing attention. Participatory art has emerged as a distinctive form of its own that directly engages the viewer in the creative process. The artwork produced can take many forms. It could be an event, a situation, a performance, and it doesn't always necessitate the production of an art object. Sometimes the participation by a range of people could create an artwork, but also sometimes it's the interaction itself that emerges from those encounters that is described as the art. This kind of art form de-emphasizes the role of the professional artist as the sole creator or author of the artwork, while building social bonds through communal meaning and activity. Of course, participation in the collective creation of art is not new. Across the globe, throughout recorded history, people have participated in the creation of art, from traditional music and dance to community festivals to mural arts. However, viewer participation in art was condemned by formalists, such as the early 20th century critic Roger Fry, who maintained that the role of the viewer was simply to try and decipher the artist's message without any personal interference. For formalists, the most important aspect of a work of art is its form, that is, the way it's made and its purely visual aspects, rather than any narrative content or relationship to the physical world. Fry used the then cutting-edge technology of wireless communication as an analogy for the idea that artists should be thought of as the transmitter, the art object the medium, and the spectator the receiver of the meaning of a work of art. Essentially, the role of the viewer is simply to clear away any messy static inhibiting the clear reception of the artist's ideas. At the same time, the Futurist and Dada performances of the early 20th century, which were designed to provoke, scandalize, and agitate the public, raised questions with regards to notions of originality and authorship, and challenged conventional assumptions about the passive role of the viewer. In doing so, they adopted an anti-bourgeois position on the role and function of art. The climax of Berlin Dada was the International Dada Fair of 1920, the central symbol of which was an effigy of a German officer with the head of a pig that hung from the ceiling. In 1921, Dada artists created a series of events that moved out of the cabaret halls and into the streets, involving the general public. These events came to be known as artificial hells. In one such event, Dada artists and writers held a mock trial of the anarchist-turned-nationalist Maurice Barrès, in which members of the public were invited to sit on the jury. Another event involved an excursion to a church and drew more than 100 people despite the pouring rain. Later, in the 1950s and 60s, social, political and cultural upheavals and the elitism and commodification of art associated with modernism contributed to new forms of politicized and socially engaged practice, such as conceptual art, Fluxus, happenings, and Situationism. The Situationist International movement was founded in 1957. Like the Dadaists and the Surrealists before them, Situationists wanted to break down the division between artists and consumers and make cultural production a part of everyday life. Guy Debord was a key figure of this movement. In his 1967 text, The Society of the Spectacle, Debord argued that the capitalist society had moved away from a focus on production towards a focus on consumption, and in the process had perfected tools to manipulate the masses and transform them into mindless, passive consumers of its goods. He described the spectacle as an extension of the idea of reification, where what was directly lived has moved away into a representation. All real relationships have been replaced by that of relationships with commodities, and where commodities have a life of their own, the autonomous movement of the non-living. To break from these sorts of consumerist experiences, Situationists experimented with the construction of situations, designed to shake the viewer's passive acceptance of the role of non-thinking spectator. Debord's theory of constructed situations involved participatory events using experimental behavior to break the bind of capitalism. This often involved détournement, the appropriation of images and texts from the mass media superimposed with a revolutionary context. To understand the essence of détournement, it is useful to understand its opposite, recuperation, which occurs when originally subversive works and ideas are themselves appropriated by mainstream media. One really iconic example of this is the corporate selling of Che Guevara t-shirts. Like Situationists, Fluxus and Happenings also sought to break down the distinctions between art and life. As I discussed in the first video from the Defamation and Hybrid Identities series, Alan Capro devised his happenings in the late 1950s. He chose the word happening to suggest something spontaneous, something that just happens to happen. Happenings involved performances and events in which the audience's participation was key. Invitations to the events said, "You will become part of the happenings. You will simultaneously experience them." Through happenings, the separation between life, art, artist and audience becomes blurred. Capro said, "The line between art and life should be kept as fluid and perhaps as indistinct as possible." Alan Capro sought from the happenings a heightened experience of the everyday, in which viewers were formally fused with the space-time of the performance, and thereby, in fact, lost their identity as audience. Similarly, Fluxus artists rejected traditional principles of craftsmanship, permanency of the art object, and the notion of the artist as a specialist. Fluxus artists viewed art not as a finite object, but as a time-based experience, employing performance and theatrical experiments. Fluxus artists were interested in the transformative potential of art through collaboration. Spectators were encouraged to interact with the performer, while plotless staged events left artworks open to artistic chance and interpretation. The artist operated largely as a facilitator, engaging the audience in philosophical discussions about the meaning of art. Artworks often took the form of meetings and public demonstrations, whereby the meaning of the work was derived from the collective engagement of the participants. One example of this is Yoko Ono's Cut piece, which I already discussed in the Defamation and Hybrid Identities series. Ono invited the audience to cut away her clothing as she sat completely still and expressionless on stage. The interaction between artist and viewer is incredibly intimate, and the viewer completely invades the personal space of the artist, literally cutting away the boundary between the two. The presumed authority of the artist was challenged in particular by conceptual artists, who placed an emphasis on the idea or concept rather than a tangible art object. In 1967, Sol LeWitt published an essay which is largely considered to be the movement's manifesto. In paragraphs on conceptual art, he wrote, "What the work of art looks like isn't too important. No matter what form it might finally have, it must begin with an idea. It is the process of conception and realization with which the artist is concerned." The notion of valuing concept above object and the importance of realization over any aesthetic qualities drastically contradicted the theories of formalist art critics like Michael Fried. Conceptual artists used their work to question the notion of what art is, and often rejected museums and galleries as defining authorities. They created artworks which could be realized by others without even the direct intervention of the artist. Artworks could take the form of a set of instructions, for example, where participants were directly involved in the co-creation of the artwork. An example of this is Hans Haak's MoMA poll. For the Museum of Modern Art's 1970 exhibition Information, Haak conceived of a questionnaire in which museum visitors would be invited to vote on a current socio-political issue and then submit their answers in a written ballot in one of two transparent boxes, allowing people to gauge the quantity of submissions. The poll asked, would the fact that Governor Rockefeller has not denounced President Nixon's Indochina policy be a reason for your not voting for him in November? This question was not revealed to the museum before the opening of the show, and it drove at the heart of MoMA as an institution, since Governor Rockefeller was a major donor to the museum as well as a board member. There were visibly twice as many yes ballots as no's. Haak's MoMA poll is a key early example of conceptual art's politically motivated vein of institutional critique. Consider the role of art institutions, galleries, museums, publications, etc. What do you think the function and purpose of art as institutional critique might be? Institutional critique continued the tradition of idea-based art, but usually in the form of installations that questioned the assumed function and authority of a museum, by providing insight into its greater role within society at large. For example, as the judge of good taste, as investor, as tax shelter, as gatekeeper to artistic success, etc. The museum is not a neutral hall for the exhibitions of work and education of the public. Rather, it's invested in promoting certain artists, in selecting important works of art, and in shaping the economic reality that benefits its trustees and the established art world. The inherent complexity of institutional critique is that it was often staged within the very institutions that the artists were critiquing, as with Hans Haak's MoMA poll. Set in motion by the artist, the work has unforeseeable conclusions and was only realized through the audience's participation. In this way, Haak emphasizes that it's not just up to the artist to make a work of art. All works of art are dependent on a consensus for their validation as works of art. For example, a museum purchases a work and validates it. A collector collects it, a publisher makes it art by promoting it as such in a magazine or a book about art. This work demonstrates the belief that artistic production is in fact a collective, not individual process. Sol LeWitt's paragraphs on conceptual art advocated the idea that the work doesn't necessarily need to be fully authored by the artist. He said, when an artist uses a conceptual form of art, it means that all of the planning and decisions are made beforehand, and the execution is a perfunctory affair. The idea becomes a machine that makes the art. An example of this is Vito Acconci's following piece. The artist followed random individuals on the street until they entered into private spaces. The parameters of the work, such as the goal, documentation, and method, were all decided in advance by Acconci. But the unpredictable movements of the strangers that he followed were not, however, controlled by the artist. So, what do you think the point of this activity was? Pause here, Marta, and just briefly discuss what you think Acconci was getting at by following strangers in the street. In essence, following piece was concerned with the language of our bodies, not so much in a private manner, but in a deeply public manner. By selecting a passerby at random until they entered a private space, Acconci submitted his own movements to the movements of others, showing how our bodies are themselves always subject to external forces that we may or may not be able to control. In his notes that the artist kept during the performance, Acconci wrote, "Following piece, potentially, could use all the time allocated and all the space available. I might be following people all day long, every day, through all the streets in New York City. In actuality, following episodes ranged from 2 or 3 minutes when someone got into a car and I couldn't grab a taxi, to 7 or 8 hours when a person went to a restaurant or a movie, for example. In terms of the artwork, rather than just being another object that we look at in the gallery, Following Peace was part of the revolution that took place in the art world in the late 1960s that tried to bring art out of the gallery and into the street in order to explore real issues such as space, time, and the human body. In a similar way, Vali Export brought the nude figure out of the gallery space and into the streets, with her performances such as Action Pants Genital Panic and Tap and Touch Cinema. I've already discussed her work, Action Pants Genital Panic, in the Defamation and Hybrid Identities lecture, in which she marched into a cinema wearing pants with the crotch cut out, challenging the audience to look at the real thing instead of passively enjoying the women's bodies on the screen. In her performance Tap and Touch Cinema, Export once again activates the viewer by inviting them to participate in an interactive cinema experience, replacing the cinema with a box and the screen with her own bare body.
Sie brauchen nur Ihre beiden Hände durch diesen Eingang einzuführen und Sie erleben den gütigsten und dafür schönsten Vielfalt.
In another performance, Homometer 2, Export approached people in a crowded shopping district and offered them the opportunity to cut a slice of bread from the large loaf hanging around her neck over her stomach. She explains, "Bread is a symbol of motherhood, and grain is a symbol for the seed, for life. The bread gives my body the appearance and prestige of a pregnant woman." Another similar work that also relied on participants for its completion was Imponderabilia. For this work, Marina Abramovich and her longtime partner Ulay face each other, completely nude, and flank the entrance of the museum, obliging visitors to turn and squeeze through their nude bodies to enter. So what do you think the purpose of this work was? What draws your attention when you watch the video?
The idea was the artist as a door of the museum. We was invited for the big performance festival in museum in Bologna at the time, and we decided to rebuild the main entrance of the museum smaller and stood there completely naked. So the public who have to come to the museum to see the performances have to make a choice to face one or another of us because the entrance is so narrow they could not go frontally. The performance was to be 6 hours, but only after 3 hours the police came and they asked us for the documents, for the passports. Of course we didn't have, and that was the end of that piece.
While the piece is obviously designed to draw immediate attention to the performer's nudity, the real concept at work is the exploration of the public's reaction to the nudity, to the performer's placement, and most importantly, the way in which the individual visitors choose to enter. Do they appear demure or embarrassed while entering? Do they opt to face Abramovich or Ulay while passing through? Do they choose to enter the museum at all? Abramovich and Ulay carry out their concept in the most dispassionate manner possible, thus leaving expression to the visitors. The resulting photographs and video of the performance act as something of a study in human behaviour when faced with something truly strange, even stressful. So what do you think these three works have in common? Vito Accioni's Following Peace, Vali Export's Tap and Touch Cinema, and Imponderabilia by Marina Abramovich and Ulay. A common goal of Fluxus, Happenings and Situationist events was to develop a new synthesis between politics and art, where political activism was mirrored in arts practice as a radical means to eliminate distinctions between art and life. However, formalist critics continued to react to these developments. For example, in Michael Fried's 1967 essay, Art and Objecthood, he demanded a return of art from this depraved state of theatricality to one of presentness, in which the artwork would again become a self-contained object, whose existence is in no way altered or compromised by the presence of the viewer. However, Literary theorists like Roland Barthes and Hans Robert Jauss, who rejected the idea of a passive reader, were also having a significant impact on art. I already discussed Barthes' notion of the death of the author in my postmodern storytelling lecture. In short, Barthes theorized that no author can claim to have completely original ideas, and that the real author of any piece of writing is in fact the reader, who brings it to life through their own connections, associations, experiences, and knowledge. Therefore, he argues, the source of a text's meaning is the reader's participation with it. Similarly, German literary theorist Hans Robert Jauss' reception theory theorizes that the reader does not passively receive a text, but actively negotiates with it to reach an interpretation based on his or her cultural background and personal experience. Reception theory is based on Reception theory is based on the idea that the meaning of a text is located somewhere between the reader and the text, and that each person will decode the text slightly differently depending on their background, cultural life experiences, and the access they have to the frameworks of power that enable them to make informed judgments. These revelations had a significant impact on the trajectory of contemporary art.